Hi there. In today's podcast, we're going to ask, why are tall buildings environmentally unfriendly? Recent articles in the media have revealed that a typical skyscraper will have at least double the carbon footprint of a 10-story building of the same floor area. Tall buildings are structurally more demanding than lower ones and require more steel and concrete. We're in the middle of a climate crisis, and Ealing Council have made a pledge to be carbon neutral by 2030, which on paper sounds encouraging. But what doesn't make any sense is why the council are allowing so many developers to fill Ealing with environmentally unfriendly concrete tower blocks. There are currently at least 25 blocks of over 20 stories, 13 over 30 stories, and 4 at 50 and 50 stories, either being built or planned to be built. The question is, how can Ealing Council be carbon neutral by 2030 and allow developers to build so many tower blocks? So with me today is Nick Faraday from Friends of the Earth and Dr. Gerald Power, also from Stop the Towers. Nick, hi there.
Hello.
How can Ealing reach their pledge to be carbon neutral by 2030 and allow the building of so many tower blocks?
Well, the simple answer is that they can't meet their carbon pledge and build all these tower blocks. I think they have now realised that, because when you look at the climate strategy that not many people have heard of but has just gone through a public consultation, you'll see that that climate pledge to get us to zero carbon by 2030 is actually just been dropped. It's not there. So we had, with a lot of publicity, a climate motion agreed by all the councillors, and that's been quietly dropped, and the strategy says nothing about it. So it asks all sorts of questions about the way Ealing Council behaves and its climate strategy or lack of it, quite apart from the building of the tower blocks.
Okay, that's quite shocking news. We'll come back to that shortly, but moving on to actually the building of tower blocks, what's concrete and brick got to do with carbon?
Well, quite a lot. It's not that they necessarily contain carbon or very much carbon themselves, but certainly making concrete is a very intensive industrial process, and it produces huge amounts of carbon dioxide. The concrete may not be made here, it may be made abroad, but it still produces carbon dioxide that affects us all. And basically, the more concrete and cement that you use in putting up buildings, the more carbon emissions go out into the atmosphere. And that's the basic problem. That's why these large buildings and new buildings are so much worse than renovating existing buildings.
And once the tower blocks are built, why do they produce more carbon when people live in them?
Well, the tower blocks are not built to be energy efficient. That's clear. They're built to maximize the profit of the developer. And so they tend to have poor insulation standards and don't have, modern high quality environmental controls. Even if they put those in, it would be difficult, because the tower blocks that are being proposed tend to be very tall, thin slabs with a very large surface area. So in summer, they get overheated and people may even need air conditioning, and that's incredibly energy intensive. And in winter, they will lose a lot of heat because they won't be well insulated. And so they'll need a lot of heating. So they tend to be worse than low-rise buildings.
And of course, if you're thinking of a flat with a single unit, south facing, for example, that's going to need an awful lot of air conditioning to keep it cool in the summer, especially if you have a summer like we've just had.
That's right. But the person on the other side might well be having to heat it, because there'll be no heating from there, or may even be in the shadow of another tower block.
Gerald, hi there, Gerald.
Hi, Justine.
Hello. So why is building lifespan so important? Could you explain that?
Well, I think we've touched on it already, with the fact that a huge amount of carbon dioxide is put into the atmosphere when you create the concrete and the steel to build buildings. And you might argue that that's okay if you only do it very infrequently. I remember once visiting the Colosseum in Rome, which was built from concrete, strangely, nearly 2,000 years ago. So that bit of concrete's probably had a fairly good design life, that it's still standing there 2,000 years later. The problem is when you build large buildings out of concrete and then you knock them down within a few decades. So a building like Percival House, which is about 40 years old, or the Green Man Estate, which has recently been demolished for a new development, that's about 50 years old. So you've seen that would have been probably tens of thousands of tons of concrete, thousands of tons of steel, an incredible amount of carbon dioxide put into the atmosphere 50 years ago to build that estate. We're knocking it down and we're putting even more in to replace it. So if you're going to build in concrete, you want to build something that's going to really last. And these kinds of tower blocks tend not to have a very long design life before you either have to knock them down and rebuild them, or you have to do a major refurbish on them. So it's very carbon intensive.
And when people use the word sustainable living, what do they mean by that? Sustainable living and working, and how does that fit in? Is that to do with COVID?
It's not to do with COVID, but COVID has brought a lot of this kind of home to us, some of the messages. The idea of sustainable living it's a broad term. I don't claim to be an expert on it, but it's the idea that your whole lifestyle is more sustainable, has a lower impact on the planet. So that implies the carbon and the energy you use getting to work in the morning, going to the supermarket, leisure activities, getting to school. And that implies trying to design cityscapes, living environments where somebody can live without having to use a car every day or get on a train every day. So a lot of people have had to work from home with COVID. A lot of them would like to continue doing that. In some ways, it can be good because it lowers the environmental impact. Certainly, it's good if you can walk to school in the morning with your kids and you can walk to the supermarket. Whereas, designing neighborhoods around people having to commute 20 or 30 miles every day to work, not so environmentally sustainable.
Yeah, could I just add? I'll add to that.
Yeah,
What
please do.
Gerald,
Yeah.
yeah, what Gerald says is absolutely right about sustainable living. The problem is that if a person goes and lives in a tower block, they have, in a sense, already consumed, at least indirectly, vast amounts of materials and have emitted masses of carbon dioxide, because a study done by the Architects Journal showed that if a building lasts 60 years, there's as much embedded carbon in it as the amount of carbon that will be produced by people living in it for 60 years. So as soon as you build that block, you've emitted the carbon, and you can't recover that by sustainable living. That's the problem.
Gerald, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's very true because, there's been some incredible leaps forward in terms of smart design for sustainable housing, affordable housing, and normal market housing, and the concept of the passive house, the house that generates nearly or more energy than it consumes. Whereas these tower developments are the absolute opposite. They're very energy intensive in building them, and they're very energy intensive in running them. So you could say they are almost the antithesis of that idea of sustainable living.
So what if they kind of say they're going to offset it with outside space or green space or a living wall or something? How does that work?
In reality, that is the most cynical kind of greenwashing. I mean, and I've seen that in buildings where a developer has put a living wall in there and it maybe lasts 12 or 18 months, and it's probably produced a lot more carbon than if you just left that brick wall alone. It's quite cynical. I mean, the other thing I'd say is the idea of building dormitory housing is quite unsustainable, that you build lots of high density tower blocks in areas outside town with the intention that people have to commute in and out to work. It's not the whole idea of sustainable.
So there's currently approximately 12,000 people on Ealing's waiting list, on the social housing list, and on their waiting list in general. A lot of the arguments that people will give you when you say that you don't want tower blocks, a lot of the arguments that people come back with are, well, people need homes. It's like, okay, so Nick, with that in mind, is there any alternative if we want to have more homes?
Well, what we have to do is just look at this assertion that we need ever so many more homes. What most people agree we actually need is homes that people can afford. We need affordable housing, we need social housing. And as you said, there are 12,000 people on the Ealing waiting list. But Ealing is going absolutely bananas. Ealing Council has almost an ideological fervour for building flats, and it wants to build 28,000 housing units in the next 10 years, which would have be occupied by some 40,000 people. So that's vastly more than the 12,000 on the waiting list. And of course, those flats would be expensive. They're not affordable because this is a trick being used by developers. They say we need homes when actually we need affordable homes. And then they build blocks of flats with very few affordable and even fewer social units. So it's not meeting the social requirements of this borough. It's basically a profit-making exercise because they make the landowners and the developers make absolutely vast profits from these tower blocks, because you can sell it for actually 2 or 3 times as much as it actually physically cost to build. So there are gigantic profits, and I estimated those as £2 billion over the next few years in Ealing.
And can I add into that? Because there's another aspect to this, which is if anybody lives in Ealing and has wandered around Dickens Yard of a dark winter's evening, will see that a lot of those houses, those flats, don't have the lights on because they're not occupied. And that's one of the other features of these developments, is that they're often bought by people as investments and left empty.
Well, they could be trying to be sustainable and try and keep the lights off to save energy. You never know.
Well, I mean, Justine, we both know that there is a big problem in foreign speculators buying homes in London purely as an investment. And in terms of environment, that is terrible. And also, it's an impact on the local community. Both, it's pushing up the property prices, and it's also meaning you've built units and they're completely unused.
So, Nick, how do we build more homes without building into the sky?
Well, noting what I was saying, that the issue isn't necessarily about building more homes. It's about building the homes that are actually needed by local people, by people who are not wealthy, basically. The intensification is possible. It's going on over the borough, and it's not as devastating as these tower blocks by a margin. But what it needs is Ealing Council to actually take a stand and just simply say, no, we're not going to give planning permission for large tower blocks that are basically used for speculation that won't house ordinary people on ordinary salaries. It needs a much stronger council, not a surprisingly a Labour council that really is just selling off the borough to developers and speculators. So let's have a proper debate about what housing we really need for ordinary people, and then discuss how many blocks we build.
I'd completely agree with that, and the fact that it feels that Ealing is focusing all of its efforts, even to the point of having its own web page to encouraging foreign investors to build these kind of high density towers to hit targets, but it isn't doing things like, as Nick implied, looking at some of the smaller sites that might require a lot more care and attention, might not turn a big profit, but would actually create sustainable, well-designed living for people within the borough, and of the kind that we need in terms of family homes.
Exactly. Nick, you had some figures that you mentioned. As part of Stop the Towers and the Red Block Rebels, we've done quite a lot of research. I think my figures are probably quite low, but the plans are to build more than 42,000 units to house over 100,000 residents.
Yeah.
That is massive. It seems very excessive. And I totally agree with you. A lot of these flats are not affordable for people who live and work in the borough. They simply can't reach. I mean, and also the other argument that developers use is the word genuinely affordable. And it's like, well, when you break that down, it's not actually genuinely affordable. We went to a presentation the other evening of the Manor Road site, and the developers and the housing association were just trying to convince us that a 3-bedroom flat marketed on their website for £675,000 was targeting low-income families. It's like, what planet are you living on if you think somebody on a low income can afford £675,000 for a 3-bedroom flat? That's just preposterous. Whether or not it's shared ownership or not, it's still a ridiculously high amount of money.
Indeed. Indeed, yeah. What I would say is that the London Mayor required Ealing Council to build 28,000 units. I think you've estimated it's 42,000, which shows that Ealing is going way. It just seems to be wanting to build flats for their own sake, as far as I can see. But what's interesting is that the London planners just finished an inspection. An independent inspector has reported and says you don't need a target of 28,000. He says it should be reduced to 21,000. So what you've got here is a council just going completely out of control, not doing what other people think it's required to do, just seeming to want to build for its own sake. And you just have to ask yourself, why? Why don't they start representing the people who actually live here instead of speculators?
I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Nick, completely. And that very much is the tone that's been set in Ealing at the moment across the whole borough. There's a lot of people saying exactly the same thing. There are a lot of flats in Ealing. There's a lot of flats in Ealing for sale. There are a lot of flats in Ealing being built. There is a lot of flats about to be built. And as Gerald mentioned, Dickens Yard, for example, you only have to walk around Dickens Yard in the evening to realise it's a ghost town and it's dark and there's no one really living there. And they lay empty for half the year and it's soul destroying. When you know people genuinely need homes, it's like, well, there are homes there, they're just not being used. And as what you said as well, Nick, refurbishing a house, doing it up properly, getting it back, actually putting money into a building, so just pulling it down and putting something up is far more effective and far more sustainable. But so many of the new builds are being marketed in Asia. We're not just saying that. We've actually seen adverts in the papers for it. Mm-hmm. So surely the way to solve a housing crisis would be to build environmentally friendly homes, which are actually genuinely affordable and available to those on the housing list, and not to allow so many new builds to be sold overseas. That would be the answer, I would have thought. Gerald, just looking at the proposal for the Manor Road application to build the 21-storey tower block, it's on a very, very, very small site in the predominantly low-rise Edwardian and Victorian neighbourhood. The plans don't appear to have much outside green space, if at all. Many of the units are south-facing over a busy, noisy railway. What are your thoughts about these plans with regards to its carbon footprint?
Well, I think it's a really good example of all of the bad practice we've kind of talked about so far, in that it's a very, very tall, thin building. That is a tiny site. And it needs to be incredibly tall to make it work commercially, which means a tall, thin building which will inherently be energy inefficient.
Let me just interrupt you there, Gerald, because it's not as tall and thin as what it was initially. So they have come down in height, but not that much. So it's not as thin, but it's still, we would still consider it a tall, thin building, don't we?
It's not enough to affect the carbon impact, because going to that kind of height means that you'll have to structurally strengthen the lower floors. It also means on this kind of site, you'll need to go very, very deep in terms of foundations. And that's probably going to be quite tricky right next to a railway and a bridge. So you're going to put in very deep, heavy foundations full of concrete and steel. You've then got a very heavy structure full of concrete and steel going up. So the embodied carbon is going to be huge. Because of its height, you're going to be very reliant on lifts to get up and down the building. So again, very heavy energy use. We know from the design it's going to be almost impossible to cool it in the summer. They've not talked about air conditioning, but it would seem that inevitably the tenants are going to have to install air conditioning to make it livable, particularly with a noise issue. So I think on all fronts, this does. I think Nick mentioned it, the idea that profits put above all else. In terms of environment, this design makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. In terms of profit and shoehorning as many units as possible onto the site, it makes sense.
And what's the problem with air conditioning for people that don't realise?
Well, the thing, strangely, across the world, I think Nick will probably correct me if I'm wrong on this. We, as a species, we tend to use more energy cooling ourselves than heating.
That's right.
Air conditioning is incredibly energy intensive, and it's something that we shouldn't really need to do if we have good design of buildings. And particularly, you think about it, in London, you should be able to design buildings that are not reliant on air conditioning to be livable.
It's true. Nick, what do you think about that?
No, I think that's absolutely right. Air conditioning is a real issue. It's vastly more energy intensive than heating by the same amount. And but of course, you shouldn't need it in a country like this that is, at least not yet, very hot. With suitable insulation and with good design, you can avoid the need for heat. Natural ventilation is perfectly possible with low-rise buildings. I open my windows if it's hot in summer. They won't be able to open windows at the tops of these tower blocks, I suspect.
Well, this is a particularly bad site for that because of the very heavy noise from the mainline railway right next to the site. So again, it's profit over common sense that you would think you would not want to put people living in a building within, I think the lower floors are probably within about 10 meters of a mainline track, which means that the only way it's livable is to have very heavy sound insulation, which means it's very likely to overheat in the summer.
They talked about having winter gardens on the south-facing flats. What's a winter garden? Is that like a garden that's in glass, or what is a winter
Well,
garden?
Justine, I think in all honesty, this is just window dressing for the design. It looks nice to show pictures of trees on it. It looks vaguely green. I really doubt that much of that greenery would survive the first couple of years at that kind of height in that environment.
But what is a winter garden? Is that something that's kind of enclosed in glass?
I don't know what the developer's definition of it is. It looks like a kind of a small balcony. I think it was something like 50 meters squared. Um, I can't imagine it's going to be a very comfortable place to sit most of the year at that height, exposed to the wind and the railway noise. And I think Network Rail's forced them to put quite high glass walls around it because of the risks of things dropping onto the mainline track.
Mm. Oh, that's the roof garden, isn't it? So, in terms of the materials being used to build the Manor Road site, in terms of the environmental impact.
Well, I mean, it's a very tall building, so you've got no options but to use concrete and steel. In the original design, there was also a very large amount of glass. They're all very energy intensive materials.
Yeah.
If the build was much lower, you might have the option of using other materials that were much less energy intensive. And certainly you would have the option of designing it in a way that made it much easier to heat and cool.
Nick, did you have a chance to have a look at the Manor Road development?
No, I haven't looked at it, but it all sounds perfectly sensible what Gerald is saying. And of course, the things he's saying will apply to all the other developments that are proposed. So while people may be concerned about this particular development, there are similar threats all over the borough, and we need to oppose those as well.
Mm. I mean, you could looking at Percival House. I mean, that's another whole Dickens yard being built with, again, another 26-story tower block. Again, no green space being offered, no gardens to talk about. And then you can look at the Gunnell development as well, because that's on metropolitan land. And if anyone saw the floods at the weekend, I mean, part of it was flooded. They're floodplains. So would you advise building tower blocks on floodplains?
Well, even if the tower block is proofed against them, the more floodplain land you build on, the worse the flood problem becomes for everybody else. So what you're seeing here is tower blocks being built to benefit a very small group of people, but impacting adversely on absolutely everybody, because of course flooding could extend miles away. It's not just people who are within the shadow and can see it when they leave their home. It affects people miles away. And of course, climate change we've been talking about affects absolutely everybody. So it's very much benefits for the few and costs for the many, this project of tower block building.
Nick, just going back to something you said at the beginning about Ealing Council dropping their pledge, could you expand a bit more on that, please?
Well, a while ago now, 18 months ago, Ealing Council voted on a motion basically to address climate change, to get to zero carbon by 2030. And that was supported by all councillors of all political parties. What the motion also said is that the council should come up with a climate strategy to achieve this. And the climate strategy, the draft strategy, was published about 6 months ago, has just been to public consultation. But what's happened is it's just what I would call a ragbag of ideas and possible policies. There is no strategy. There are no targets. There's no plan to get to zero emissions by 2030. And there's no mention of the original climate motion by the council. So all the sort of, if you like, the political impetus has gone, and the council clearly doesn't intend to even try and reach zero carbon by 2030, which is absolutely shocking, basically. We should all be appalled.
Well, we are appalled. So, Gerald, your thoughts on that, please?
Well, strangely, I was about to say something along the same lines. And I think that the thing that absolutely sums it up is the idea that the council thinks it can build a tower block over 21 stories high out of concrete and steel, and that it will be green because you've put a bicycle rack at the bottom. And it's utterly ludicrous. Or the idea that they can green the borough by blocking roads with low traffic neighborhoods. It's I think Nick described it correctly. It's just a rag bag of disconnected, vaguely green, woolly thinking without any kind of substance or direction to it. And if I'm at my most charitable, I would say it's through utter naivety and lack of understanding. If I was less charitable, I would say that they've decided that their priority is development and the climate go hang.
But how can the council keep going on about our pledge to be carbon neutral by 2030? It's not something they're saying. They said 2 years ago. It's something they keep saying. It's something that Julian Bell keeps saying. We keep seeing videos of him. We keep seeing it. So, Nick, you're saying that it's been dropped.
Yeah. Well, as I say, if the official council climate strategy doesn't mention it, then it's been dropped. You know, what Julian Bell says, which is unofficial and is not necessarily council policy, isn't what you should judge it by. What I would say is they did set themselves a very ambitious target, and it's very difficult to actually see how they would achieve that, bearing in mind the council doesn't have control over all the emissions in the borough. But I think what we would expect is them to be open and honest. Why don't they try and produce a draft strategy that tells us the truth and actually have a genuine debate and see where we get with that? Not just try and pretend they're going for zero carbon when they're clearly not.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because whether people disagree or agree with the low traffic neighbourhoods, I think everyone would like to live in a low traffic neighbourhood and everyone wants greener, cleaner air. Let's not get into the debate here right now about those schemes, because that's a different subject entirely.
Can I just say, rather than being accused of being a NIMBY, I mean, I visited Copenhagen and Amsterdam and other cities which have lower traffic neighbourhoods, and they're brilliant.
Yeah,
they really work if they're thought through correctly. The point I was trying to make is it needs to be part of a bigger strategy to work.
Yeah, but the point I was going to make was, on the one hand, you've got the council saying we want cleaner air, low traffic neighbourhoods, and then they've got a camera car with an engine running all day long with a camera to catch people out who are breaking the rules. It's like, hold on, that car's running its engine all day long to catch people out in the low traffic neighbourhood. There's a bit of hypocrisy that's going on, and also the fact that some of the residents' shared parking bays have been sold off to anybody could drive into Ealing in any kind of car, in any kind of gas guzzling vehicle, and park all day, I think, for £4.50, and use our borough as a car park. So you're either going to be, we're trying to be carbon neutral, have a green strategy, and we're going to do this, or we're not. And as Nick says, or we're going to be honest about it and saying we're not really, but we are a little bit. It doesn't. I don't think you can be both. You can't say this is my pledge and then build a tower block. It doesn't. The two don't add up, and that's the problem. Be honest about it, please. Gerald, any further thoughts? Any more comments from you, please? Do you have anything else to say?
Well, I would really like to see local councillors raising their voices if they were genuinely supportive of the zero carbon pledge, or going as far as we can. And I honestly think many of them do have a personal commitment to it. They need to stand up and call it out and say, no, this strategy on towers and this broader strategy from Ealing, it isn't consistent with that pledge. Let's stop and revisit this.
Nick, have you got anything else you'd like to add?
I agree entirely with what Gerald said. And what I would say is councillors will only speak out and only speak up for us if we make them. And the one way we can make them speak up is to make it quite clear to them we will not vote for them at the next election, because that's the real threat. Then they have to start representing us.
I think it's what we've been saying for ages, Gerald. Ealing's not listening.
Absolutely. I mean, even if the individual councillors might have interest in this, Ealing as a council is not listening in a big way.
I think we'll leave it there. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Gerald. Thank you for joining us.
Thank
Cheers,
you.
Justine. Cheers, Nick.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye.